about to say you asked me to hold on, and I can't. I
No, it
I
was
pressed the record button.
yes. No, that's fine. All right. Well, we're live.
We are
Uh,
live. Yes. Hi,
we're
everybody. We're live. This is the Wildcat recording for the Cyber Risk Management podcast, right? It's a wild feed. And eventually, this recording is going to make it as a published episode in our audio only podcast. But if you're watching this, you're getting a sneak preview. So we're ready to go. I'm going to count back 5, 4, 3.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today in episode 195 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast?
We have a great guest. Carrie Perlson is joining us. She's going to talk about something that's been, well, bothering me for years, which is boards are getting the wrong cybersecurity information. And we'll discuss what boards really need to know, the questions they should be asking, although God bless them, they don't realize this. And we'll also talk about a practical tool that can be used to fix this problem.
That sounds great to me. And welcome to the show, Carrie. Before you tell our listeners a bit about yourself, I guess I'll just quickly mention, when we're talking about boards here, we're talking about the boards of directors of formally organized corporations. They may or may not be publicly traded. That is not, you don't have to be publicly traded to be a corporation and have a board. And really, the subcommittees that the board is composed of. And I guess my first question after you tell our listeners about yourself is, did I get it right? Is that what we mean by boards?
Well, Jake, thanks for having me. Kip, good to see you again. As you said, I'm Carrie Perlson, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about that intersection between technology, business strategy, and people or governance. And I've worked with a number of boards and C-level executives. And one of the things that keeps coming up is what we characterize, all of us on this call have characterized as a sort of a disconnect between what boards are told and what boards really need to know when it comes to cybersecurity governance and oversight. Yeah, I do agree with you that boards are those sort of top of the organization chart people, usually not even on the organization chart, usually just a little cloud that says board. They're usually composed of independent and internal people, like a CEO would be an internal person, and an external person would be someone completely unaffiliated with the company, except perhaps being on the board. They could be a board for a for-profit company, like a big Fortune 500, or they could be a board for a venture-backed company. They all have boards also. It could be a board for a nonprofit. Could be a board for even some sort of organization that wouldn't even normally be thought of as needing a board. But it's the job of the board is oversight and fiduciary responsibility to whoever the stakeholders are. In a public company, it's the stockholders. Usually they represent the stockholders, but in other companies, they represent other entities. Could be regulators, could be the public good. Even your HOA board is a board, and there's some responsibility in there for perhaps not quite the same as a corporate board, but for oversight, spending the money appropriately, managing risk. Often board's role is to hire the senior executive, which is usually the CEO, but it could be, in the case of an HOA board, it might be the manager of the building. So you could think about a board as sort of that advisory group, but the main characteristic they all have in common is sort of this fiduciary responsibility to make sure that at the highest level, and sort of bless, if you will, that the operating managers are doing the best they can, the right thing. They're not, the job of the board is not to make cybersecurity decisions. The job of the board is to oversee what the decisions are that are being made and to agree with or question appropriately what the decisions are so that they feel that the best decisions are being made.
We should probably define that term fiduciary. I think there might be some people in the audience that have heard it, but maybe don't necessarily understand what it is. So in this context, Carrie, how would you define fiduciary?
So normally it's that the money's spent right. You know, the money that the company has to spend is spent appropriately. It's not, I mean, boards get audits and they look at the audits and make sure that it's spent right, but there are decisions to be made. There's, I wouldn't call them gray areas, but there's decisions that get made that dictate the activities that the operating managers or the company or the enterprise, let's call it enterprise, can do. And so usually fiduciary is the term used to talk about oversight of how money is spent. But in this case, I'm also referring to oversight on how we manage risk. So you could say that's how money's spent, but I'm being very specific in the idea of what are the decisions that the operating leaders have made to manage the risk that is present in every enterprise because of the cyber environment in which we act.
Right. And a fiduciary has to put the interests of the organization ahead of their own, right? Isn't that another part of it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, more broadly, just in law, fiduciary duty is one where you have to act in the best interest of the whoever you owe the duty to. So, it's like, if I have a power of attorney, if I am, a court-appointed guardian for a child, there's all kinds of different ways to have a fiduciary. I mean, those are different types of duties. A fiduciary duty is, I think it is related to finance. I think fiduciary itself comes from that root. And but yeah, that's what it's about. It's about acting in the best interests. And there you go.
And I think that's important. So let's remember that as we go through this conversation. But Carrie, before we continue in this conversation, I also want to point out that that you do this work as a as somebody in the well, let's see. So you work at the MIT Sloan School of Management, right?
That's right.
Okay, so that's kind of your base, and I love that because you're doing real research, and you're getting really deep into the topic. You're not somebody that's just like doing drive-bys on this subject, right? Which is one of the reasons why I just love the fact that you've agreed to be here. Now, the fact that there's this disconnect, right, between what boards are being told versus what they ought to know or to request. So, Carrie, when you walk into a boardroom and cybersecurity comes up on the agenda, like, what do you commonly see, whether it's good or bad? Just like, tell us what you see.
Thank you for asking that, Kip, and thank you for the kind words. I'm very excited about my research agenda here because I don't think there are very many people thinking about these questions that you and I think about often. How do you build cyber resilience, and how do we keep the organization moving forward? And we'll get to that in a bit, I'm sure. But when I think about boards and I look at how they're managing cybersecurity, I almost always see the same kind of disconnect between what the operating senior leaders present to the board and what the board will do with it. So most of the time, the chief information security officer, CISO, or the IT director presents some sort of dashboard showing a bunch of controls and how they've been implemented. And it's usually red, yellow, green, and there's usually lots of green. And they say something about how many controls that they've that are operating appropriately or they're being managed appropriately. They might talk about the results of the phishing tests. They give statistics. We know there's a lot to be measured, and so they might say something like our phishing clicking rate dropped from 12% to 8% this month. They might also say, we've got 30% of our controls have to be revisited this month, or we're doing an audit. It's usually very quantitative because they think that's what the board loves, but it's also very tactical and very operational. That's usually
Yeah, and I mean, board members love this stuff, right? I mean, it's really concrete and it seems relevant, doesn't it?
Well, it seems relevant if you're coming at this from the technology perspective. First of all, I think our technology people are doing a great job. It's a really tough job to be a CISO and to manage cybersecurity for a company. And they're putting their best foot forward, and they're talking about all the things that they're doing and how secure the company is from their perspective. And I think that's really important. Second of all, I think boards dive into numbers. If you tell me that we went from a 12% rate to an 8% rate, I'm excited. I want to know why. I want to know. I can chew on that. I know what that number means. But the question to me is that really tell me how secure the company is? I mean, just because the phishing rate dropped on phishing tests doesn't mean my company's more secure. It means that the phishing rate dropped. I mean, maybe it's incrementally more secure, but that's not where the board's mindset needs to be.
It does seem
yeah, go ahead.
It does seem awfully uselessly detail oriented for the board level, and it's not. It doesn't seem like it's really helping them fulfill their fiduciary responsibility, which, by the way, I must correct myself. Um, it originally has nothing to do with money. It is from Rome. It is a Roman concept from Roman law, and it just means trust or confidence.
Awesome.
And that is the essence of the fiduciary responsibility.
And that's how we
Uh,
know that it's in your area of expertise, because it
I'm
has
so
something
glad
to
you
do with
looked that up.
Latin.
Well, I'm so
yeah,
glad you looked that up because honestly, I thought it was about the financial and it just kind of extended to some of the other areas that
no, it is
need to
not.
be managed. So thanks for that. That's awesome.
Um, yeah, and it did develop in English law, but we're not going to go into that. But I do think that because of this, because of this concept and the details, and I think what you said, Carrie, is exactly right, which is, I think it's correct to raise this question of, is this the right way for the board to be thinking about cybersecurity? Um, what do you, I mean, I'm guessing because we have this podcast that the answer is no, it isn't right. But why? Why not? Why are those metrics?
Yeah,
I mean, because you're not saying the metrics are incorrect or wrong. You're just
correct.
saying that it's not really appropriate for the board. So let's kind of talk about that.
Right. So thank you for asking that, Jake. The issue for me is the disconnect comes in what's easy to report and what the board really needs to chew on to do what we're now calling their fiduciary responsibility, to do the oversight they need to do. So if you tell a board member, as I said, that we went from a 30% compliance to a 45% compliance rate, they're going to want to know what that means. They're not dumb people. In fact, they're quite bright. Most board members have lots of experience and they're on the board because they're capable of providing this oversight. They're going to dive into the numbers. It's a little, um, and it's very enticing. But the question is, does that really tell them how secure we are? And to me, the three core questions really are something like, how secure are we? That's a much more difficult question to answer. And maybe what are the biggest cybersecurity and business risks that you see, and how are we managing them? What are we doing to mitigate that risk? And for me, the board's responsibility comes not necessarily from a dashboard that tells them everything's okay, but from a conversation with the operational managers based around those three questions, so they can really dive in and understand what position is our company in.
Yeah. Well, and before we kind of break down, what does how secure are we actually mean in practical terms? I think an example, just using the phishing numbers is helpful. It's like if I tell the board that our phishing rate went from 12% to 8%, that may not actually mean, that could still be a bad result. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that things are good. Which is why this question, how secure are we, actually gets at the issue much more directly than, what percentage did our phishing rate drop? So yeah, like what does that mean in practical terms? How secure are we? It's a very,
It feels very squishy to me.
I mean, it's a squishy abstract concept, but I think it is answerable, and I think it does work at the level of the board, but
Well, it can.
it also may challenge the operators of the business to provide an answer.
That's right. It's a good question. It's really hard to answer how secure are we. It's really easy to ask that, but it's really hard to answer. When somebody says how secure are we, or when a board asks that question, I don't think they really care about how many firewalls we have, or how many employees pass security awareness training, or who failed a phishing exercise. But those are measurable. So it's easy for
Mm-hmm.
operating managers to report. It's easier to measure progress. And as I said, boards are really good at they're really good at the financial side. So when you put numbers in front of them, it just speaks their language. However, what we're talking about here is the organization's ability to really be resilient, to continue operating if something bad happens. And I know, Kip, this is something you and I have chatted about before. It's really about are we resilient and able to operate should we have a security incident, and make sure that our operations are continuing. If our
Mm-hmm.
primary data center goes down, can we still operate? If we can't take credit cards, how are we going to process payments? If all of our computers are locked up and we communicate with people on email, how are we going to communicate with people? Have we thought about the side of cybersecurity that would keep our operations going. Now, that's not the only thing that the board needs to know about, but to me, if you're providing oversight and you're executing this trust, the duty of trust that we just talked about as part of fiduciary responsibility, then your job is to make sure that the organization can think through their ability to keep going should there be a cyber incident.
Yeah, I think that's completely reasonable in my experience. Boards are interested in the continuity of the organization, right? Because there's a mission to be accomplished, whether that's to deliver profitability to investors or to, affect some social change, in our society or, really anything. So, and then how fast can we return to our mission if we get sidetracked, right? What does that journey look like? Like, we can't do anything. Okay, well, when can we do something, right? I think that is what a board should be focused on, no matter what the cause, right? So, like, I talk to people and I say, like, well, if you can't sell, if you're a profit making entity and you can't sell what you've made, that can be a existential crisis for you. But even if you can sell, if you can't fulfill the orders, if you can't collect the money that people owe you, if you can't pay your suppliers, any one of those things can put you out of business. But a cyber attack can, chop you off at the knees on all of those areas all at once. So it's not just about preventing attacks, right?
Well, that's true. And to extend your story, it could hurt your reputation. I mean, you're part of a supply chain. And if you, let's say you inadvertently introduce malware into one of your customers' systems, then there goes their customer system and there goes your reputation. And you've got end-level suppliers behind you and you've got end-level customers in front of you. And
right.
so being resilient is more than just making sure that your system is okay, but sometimes we have to look at the entire ecosystem. So really, to me, that how secure are we is a very big question, and it doesn't have a single number answer. And I think that's the key point here. The boards love single number answers, so they're not going to say to their technology people or their audit committee, well, that's great, but let's have a deeper discussion without being prompted for that. And that's where I play. I want to give them the questions to ask. I want to give them a structured approach that's not scary, that's not terrifying, that is something doable for them.
As an operational risk manager, which is, what the CISO role, typically is very interested in, I can tell you that it scares me about going to the board and opening up what seems like a question, but really can feel like a can of worms, right? So I kind of want to bring them numbers because, it's like, I want to get in and get out,
Right.
I mean, I'm just going to be honest. As a professional, going to work, I'm intimidated by going to the board and having a bunch of people, kind of ask me a bunch of off the cuff questions. And it's like, I don't know if I'm going to do a good job of answering them. And if they don't like that, maybe they don't want me around anymore. I mean, these are the things that I worry about.
And you're not alone, Kip. I think that, this is kind of off the topic of what we were going to cover today in our podcast. Maybe it's another whole discussion. I think it's the board's job to make sure that operational managers can report honestly and comfortably to the board. But I think it's the operational managers to, step up and say, if there's a potential problem, here's a potential problem. So the more we can normalize a discussion about how secure are we, the better off we are. If you ask it once and you think you're done, that was back to the comment earlier, you're really not doing your fiduciary responsibility either. But if you ask it often and you hear about what's going on in the ecosystem or what are the risks that we see, you want to see some progress against those risks and mitigating those risks, then I think the operating manager is in a really good position. Because honestly, I'm on a couple boards, I practice what I talk about, and I learn from my boards also what we should be talking about. And I think that the more we can talk openly with our operating managers, in particular our cyber and our information systems managers, the more we can assess, are we doing the right thing? And that's really what the board's job is. Do I agree that you've made the best decision possible, or is there something I think you might consider that you didn't consider?
Yeah, and the trouble with trying to understand cybersecurity from the board perspective, and one of the reasons why the SEC has changed some rules to require it's the typical SEC mechanism of regulation, right? They don't tend to require that you do certain things or have certain people, but they will require that you tell people who's on your board and what their level of cybersecurity experience is. And I think, you run the risk of a question like, with any of these questions, frankly, if the people on the board don't have any background, they might just look at, what if I were to come on the board and say our successful phishing tests went from 25% to 20%. That's a nice percentage drop, isn't it? And if you don't have any idea about cybersecurity, you might think, oh yeah, that's a metric that went down. That's good. But 20% click rate is a massive red flag for anyone who understands cybersecurity. So I think having the discussions with the board, asking something like, how secure are we, bypasses in some ways the it bypasses the risk that the board doesn't know anything about cybersecurity, which I think is still largely true. And I think too that if whether it's the CISO or whoever is doing this report, sometimes I think that if they were the most honest they could be, they actually might end up with more support from the board rather than, but we have this negativity bias that we're too worried about, they'll think I'm doing a bad job unless I say we're totally secure. But that isn't really helpful, is it? Anyway,
No.
there's no answers. Many of those questions are rhetorical. I think we should move on to the second question, which is identifying the biggest risks. And this, Kip, is something that you and I know a lot about.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and ask Carrie, what is it about this second question? And
why is it relevant?
Why is it relevant? Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to take a step back, Jake, and just answer your rhetorical question. I see two kinds of CISOs. We used to say in the IT world, there were two kinds of CIOs. There were the business people who were CIOs, and there were the technical people who were CIOs. The technical people really understood how to run the technology. They came up through the technology ranks, and being the chief technology person, not chief technology officer necessarily, but the internal person, they were really focused on looking downward into the organization. But that role evolved over the last 30 years into CIOs that really look up. They're members of the board. They're members of the executive level, the executive team, who can talk about business from a technology perspective and see how technology applies. I don't see why we aren't going to see I expect to see the same kind of progression in our CISOs. There are CISOs who can really only talk technology. That's where they came from. And frankly, it is a very big and scary world out there for the CISOs. You just don't know where you don't know where the next thing is coming from. But there are CISOs. Some came up through the security ranks, and some came from places perhaps like you, Jake, that were a legal perspective or maybe an operational manager in another area. And they're looking up differently. They're saying, how does our business get impacted if we have cybersecurity risks? So I don't really agree that CISOs aren't in that role. There are just two distinctions, probably a whole continuum of CISOs. And we want to see more of them move to the business, have the business discussions. And so the board can encourage that by having those discussions. You don't fire the person because they didn't have the right answer the first time out of the gate. But by starting to have those kind of conversations and making it okay to be the technical person that looks at the business rather than the business person that looks at the technical is really where I think the CISOs need to go. But go ahead.
I just want to say one thing about that, Carrie, because you're really describing me. I came into the working world in the systems, part of the economy, right? All the organizations I worked in, but somebody invested in me, so I became a CISO, and about 3 years into it, the CEO of the insurance company that I worked at said, "Let's send Kip to the executive leadership program at Seattle University." And he paid for it, and he created time in my normal working schedule to do it. And it was like a 6-month experience, and it was absolutely transformative to me and fundamental to all the work I do these days. So, and it was a big investment, but it was very much appreciated, and it made a difference.
And I think that kind of exposure is super important. I'm delighted to hear that you were not only sent off to a leadership program and it was covered. There are many, many examples of that kind of learning that can take place without the investment you had to make of going for a degree. And so there are lots of ways we can get our CISOs to be more managerially focused. And I don't mean operational managerial, but with strategic focus, I guess. I'm happy to talk about those too. But you asked this question about the biggest risks. And for most board reporting, we don't really have that conversation. And that's the conversation that I think is necessary. So as we already talked about, the operating CISOs tend to present, maybe it's their control, maybe they're using a well-known model for managing the controls of their cybersecurity organization. And they are color-coded, red, yellow, green, and they can present that and they can say this many is green and these are yellow and here's what we're doing to drive those to green. And these red ones are the ones that are most concerning. And that's good. That's interesting, but it really doesn't give the board the right information. As you've already pointed out, Jake, if you don't really dive into what those colors mean or what the constructs are that they're reporting, then it might look fine if something is a yellow or is moving to a green. That's the direction we want to move in. The board wants to hear that story. But instead, I think a better approach is for the operating level leaders, the C-level team, to identify maybe the top risks that, and I mean business risks, that could seriously disrupt the business. So they could be a technology risk, like, we have old technology and that presents a risk, or they could be newer things like our supply chain is vulnerable. We've been noticing in the press that these kinds of issues are coming up in our industry, and we should be more aware of those. And that starts to raise the issue at the level of board strategy, board continuity, risk management, and those, as everyone who's written about this talks about, that's the language of the board. What is the risk? What are we doing about it? What's the impact to the business? How do we make sure we're not out of business? Should there be something? It's really because we want to make sure that we want to know what might cause a cyber incident and what are we doing about it so that we aren't impacted seriously or if at all perhaps from it.
I mean, that's right. There's all these things are critical. It's like, yes, that is all true.
But what about examples? Do you have any?
Yeah. Do you have examples?
So let me tell you a few examples. They're a little more generic, but I'll just give you some examples. So what about the company that's got a, let's say, 15-year-old control system? They're a manufacturing company. They are reliant on Windows 7 machine because that's where they built their original control systems. It's no longer supported by the manufacturer. The technology's so old, all the schematics, everything's out there. The bad guys have access to it. It's known how to breach it. But if they're so dependent on it that they can't replace it easily.
This is a really common example.
It's actually very common. And I say it, and it's not just small and medium enterprises that would do that. There are pockets in even large companies where, some enterprising programmer built a tool a long time ago and it still works. And they've just been patching it and their organization works and they operate under if it's not broke, why fix it? So, but it presents a vulnerability. And that would be something that I could see saying to the board, look, it's a big lift to fix this. We have to invest in upgrading the technology, but this is a business vulnerability. And this could be it's a perhaps small likelihood, but a huge impact if something happens to this. It would bring down our entire manufacturing process. So that's one example. What about a retail company who takes all their payments through one vendor? And let's suppose that vendor has a breach and they are no longer able to accept payment. That would be a huge impact. So having one vendor might be a business risk. Now, that might not even be something that the cybersecurity team would recognize, but that one vendor could have a breach. And when you look at supply chain and you look at who are supplying the critical processes of your organization, then it becomes pretty apparent where the weak links are. And then you just ratchet that over to, well, if there was a cyber breach in that piece of the process, what would we do about it? So these are not IT. I mean, they're technology-based problems, but they're really business problems. And that is something that the board isn't really prepared to solve for you, but would expect you to bring to the board if you are KIP, the CISO organization, and maybe discuss with us some solutions. What would we be doing about it?
I just did this recently for a manufacturing company that has outsourced. They don't call it outsourced. They call it a subscription to a SaaS provider, but they've effectively outsourced so much of their business processes, but they just hadn't been thinking it, in those terms. They're just like, oh yeah, well, we our ERP is in the cloud. And I'm like, okay, well, if your ERP stops working, how does that, cascade into, your daily life? And that's when they realized, after we, went around on a couple of those, and they're like, oh my goodness, our production line could shut down. And oh, let's pull that contract. All we're going to get is 2 months credit for fees. And I'm like, now let's pull your insurance policy. Do you have any business interruption that would come to your rescue in a situation like this? And it's just like, you just start pulling these threads, man.
Well, and that's exactly what I mean by having a discussion about the biggest business risk, because again, that might be too in the weeds for a board, but at least we're now talking about business disruption and business continuity. And really, when I think about this, I think about, we want our operations, our processes, our entire ecosystem to be able to respond and recover pretty much immediately in the face of a cyber incident. And, that's the kind of question that boards don't know to ask necessarily. Some do. I'm not saying all board members don't have cyber experience. It's in the press so often. They've all been reading about it. But those are the kind of questions that I want to talk about with my operating managers. What would happen if, as you said, our SaaS supplier stopped providing the service? Now, we think we have contracts that keep us, and you've just nicely outlined, how would you check on that and what might you check on? But the truth is that just because you have something in the cloud, even if you just have your data in the cloud, it doesn't mean that it's 100% secure. You can't be 100% secure. I think that's another key piece that the board needs to know. You can't be 100% secure. So if you can't be 100% secure, what's the alternative? How do you think about that?
Well, that leads us to our third question, doesn't it?
It does. And by the way, I think that, Kip, this ties into a feeling that I had just in one of our recent calls with a mutual client, talking about tabletops, is that there's this feeling that, doing a tabletop about just kind of yet another like little data breach type thing is just not that exciting. And I think it has to do with, a number of kind of realities, which is, cyber attacks happen. Like, you can't be 100% secure. It's not possible. And then two, what really matters? Like, what actually matters, right? If we're talking about a little, like, irritating, but maybe even expensive, just like, I get into it anywhere from a fender bender to maybe even I total my car. But if I'm not seriously injured, right, these are just kind of like things I have to deal with.
Irritants.
Irritants, yes, in a way. But if you can get the board and leadership to start understanding these core business risks that really, like if the production line shuts down, we're hosed for weeks or months. Like, that goes from being an irritant to being potentially existential.
Right. And that's catastrophe.
It is. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that boards shouldn't care about cyber risk unless it's existential, but I'm also not saying that in a way either, right? I mean, the board probably doesn't need to care about a $75,000 breach incident that gets handled by some combination of insurance and retention, right? If it isn't a really, like, it's a thing that happens, and I think figuring this out is an ongoing challenge, and that does lead to the third question about mitigation plans, right? Because these things are going to happen, the board should be thinking about, okay, we know it's impossible to be 100% secure. We know little things are going to happen. What are we doing in case something catastrophic happens? What's our plan? That is a really valid question. So yeah, what is, like, how do you think about that one?
So you're exactly right, Jake. I don't think the board needs to be weighing in on the mitigation plan for small, unimpactful perhaps, financial costs. A $75,000 breach might be a big reputational issue. So identifying where the impact might be is important. I think it's about the both the impact, the likelihood, and the recovery costs and that kind of thing, where it might impact us. But when we think about mitigation plans, once you've identified the biggest risks, the board really wants to understand what management is doing about them. And the key here is to think about it as a business process, not just a technology fix. You know, what is the business impact? What is the business process that's impacted, and what does that mean for us ultimately? So if we go back to that retail example where they have one vendor that is supplying their credit card processing, you know, there might be mitigation strategies to have a second supplier, or there might be some sort of offline verification of backup systems. We all know every company is doing backup of some sort, and a lot of people go to the cloud because it automatically does backup for you. But if you're backing up malware, you're backing up, you know, corrupted data, that's not going to help you much either. So you got to plan and practice and check on that. There is also the opportunity to accept some level of risk, and maybe you mitigate it with insurance. Maybe you just accept it because it's the impact is so unlikely, or the cost is just so little that you just assume you'll absorb it. Yeah. I think you brought up the key point, though, that I wanted to bring up here, which is about practice, tabletop exercises. It's not a matter of another tabletop exercise just to execute things or to make sure things are working the way they're supposed to. It's building that muscle. It's like going to the gym. You know, you don't go to the gym and you're buff and agile and ready to go in one visit, not even maybe in 1 month. But the more that I know, we all would love that when we. But there are exercises that build that muscle about how we're going to respond and recover. And my vision here is that a company has a cyber breach and really nothing happens because all of these muscles come back into play and they know how to respond and recover. And those muscles are the things we just talked about. Things like having plans, practicing a plan so that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. They go into business recovery mode. They go into it naturally. Maybe you can't even call your phone tree because the phone systems are down or your email systems are down. And
or your phone numbers are on a SharePoint page and you can't load SharePoint.
You can't load SharePoint. Or there's a million examples of how practice makes you a little bit more agile if and when the breach happens. And that's, I think, a piece that would be something I would want my board, I would ask from my board, what would happen if we had a breach? What kind of mode do we go into? And a tabletop exercise is a really good way to start to practice those kinds of things.
I really love the kind of conversation we're describing here that we believe boards should be having, and how different it is from what many of them are probably having. So yeah, how do we encourage boards to shift?
So now you've given me my soapbox. So let me just say quickly that I think it's really important for boards to think differently about cybersecurity. I think it's important that they're not fearful of the discussion. I think it's important that CISOs are not fearful of coming in and talking to the boards. And anything that a board member can do to make it more comfortable for the CISO to come in and vice versa, the CISO more comfortable to talk about these business risks is really important. So I've been writing a lot about this in Harvard Business Review. And one article that might be really applicable to this discussion is one I wrote about a balanced scorecard approach for boards. We really need a structured way to present this information and to present it, as you said earlier, it's not one and done, to present this on a regular basis, whether it's every board meeting or whether it's every audit committee meeting or whether it's a couple times a year or just available on an on-demand basis. But there needs to be a structured way to think about that.
Okay, and I would love to unpack that a little bit. I know we can't read the whole article. If I put the article in the show notes, could people go read it?
Sure. I mean, it's at Harvard Business Review, and I think I'm terrible at naming things. I got the concept down, but the naming is not. I'm really good. My name of it is something like a balanced scorecard for board reporting on cyber resilience or something like that. I mean, it's very big.
We'll get the URL. And we'll put it into the show notes so people who would like to can just go pull it up and get into all the details. But can you kind of explain how this works?
Sure, it's pretty straightforward. A few years ago, there was a concept written up by a couple of Harvard professors, Robert Kaplan and David Norton, on a balanced scorecard approach for financial reporting. And some of you and some of your listeners may remember that it was a concept to stay, instead of just looking at bottom line profit and revenue, we really need to be looking at KPIs in different areas like both finance, customers, internal processes, and learning. And look at the financial side and the impact on business strategy, business operations of all of these different areas to understand the health of our organization. So that really impacted me. I was a student at Harvard at the time that they came out with this article, and I've been noodling in the back of my head for many years. And I thought, that's exactly the approach we need with cybersecurity. So the balanced scorecard for cyber resilience reporting to the board takes a similar view. It says, let's take a look at not just what the controls look like, but let's look and see what are the biggest risks that we're facing in operations and technology and supply chain and financial. Maybe you want to add a fifth one like regulatory. And for each of those quadrants, we want to ask the question, what is the biggest risk we're facing today? We want to understand the likelihood and the magnitude of it. And what are we doing about it? And then the second piece of each quadrant could be a red, yellow, green scorecard of some sort of the controls, if you feel that's important and your board wants to know those. But the focus is to spark discussion on really what is the biggest risk and what are we doing about it. And to focus it on the ones that are high likelihood and high magnitude, not just that are low likelihood or low magnitude, but if there are no high likelihood, high magnitude, then of course, then the next level down is something that's still the board needs to know about because it is likely and it does have impact. So it's envision, a 2x2, which is a standard Harvard approach, and each quadrant has an answer of what is the biggest risk we think we see right now in that quadrant, and what are we doing about it, and then some sort of measure, red, yellow, green of our controls.
Oh, I can't wait to check this out in a little bit more detail. I definitely want to pull up your article. Then, of course, I'm gonna say, Carrie, I have questions. You need to talk to me, right? I'm gonna ask for more of your time. So I love that it puts a focus on business impact. But do you get pushback? I mean, have you actually suggested using this? What happens when you do that?
So that's a really good question. It does get pushback from well, actually, everybody agrees that it's a good way to look at it, but implementing it is a little bit more tricky than it sounds. To me, it just seems so obvious. We want to talk about business risk. Tell me what you think the business risk is. But the CISOs aren't always focused on the business risk. So having that discussion with the CISO isn't necessarily as productive as I'd like to make it, but it does force the CISO to start figuring that level out. But there's probably a transition time to get the board to the point where that kind of reporting is as useful as I envision it being for them. But I have seen companies use it. Usually the CISO starts with more technology risk. We notice that our vulnerability scanning software is out of date, and that opens us up to business risk of malware coming into our systems. I mean, that is to some extent a way to look at cybersecurity from a business perspective, but it isn't really as much in the weeds. It's more in the weeds than I'd like to be. It's not as much in the weeds that I think that the board wants to spend. But the more that the board asks these questions, my article's written more from a poll perspective. If the board starts asking these questions of the CISO and the CEO, I don't think it's just the CISO's responsibility, it's operating managers. The more we see the discussion elevated to the level of what is the biggest business risk we're seeing and what are we doing about it, and feeling comfortable that we have identified where we need to be spending our time. Again, fiduciary responsibility. Where should we be spending our time and our resource? And if you're telling me this is the biggest business risk, then I you're my operating manager, I trust you, then I want to make sure that, I want to know how you're thinking about it. And that's where the discussion goes.
I love that you said not just the CISO, but also the CEO should be part of this conversation. And I don't know if you've seen it yet, but just today, just before we started recording, I sent out an email to a bunch of people about the Qantas story that I just saw, Qantas Airlines, where they sanctioned the CEO by docking her compensation for a data breach that they suffered. And it wasn't just the CEO, it was other senior decision makers at this organization. And I can't remember really ever seeing this kind of direct sanction before on a CEO. And so it seems to me like this is a inflection point potentially in governance, corporate governance with respect to cybersecurity. But I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's fair for me to ask you what you think about that. But I just happened to see that today, and so you just reminded me of it.
Well, and I mean, I haven't seen that specific story. I've heard other stories where CEOs have been sanctioned for some sort of cybersecurity issue. We know stories of companies where CEOs have lost their job because the impact of a cyber breach was so grievous that it fell on their desk, even though they probably had nothing to do with why it happened or how it happened. And that's part of the scary stories about cybersecurity. We just don't know where the next big impact is going to come from. Nobody thought supply chain until we started seeing supply chain attacks. Nobody thought, phishing and human risk until we started seeing human risk based.
It's so reactive, but I mean, that's just the way it is, right? I don't know how to change that. But I love the idea of a balanced scorecard for cybersecurity at the board level. I think it's fantastic. We're running out of time for our episode.
We are. I'm
we're
amazed
going to have
how
to
much,
wrap up.
It just disappeared.
It always does, right? We always start these episodes
does.
going, I wonder if we have enough to talk about. And then, yes, of course, we always do. But, okay, so before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, Carrie, I think you've said it, but I would love for you to summarize it again. The one piece of advice that you'd give to a CISO who wants to do a better job reporting to their board.
So I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about thinking like a business executive, not like a security technician. I think that's the one piece of advice. Put your head into what does your board want to know, and then talk to them about what it is you think they want to know, or ask them, build relationships with them, so that like the boards aren't independent people who don't talk to each other. They build relationships, but think like a business executive and approach this question of what's the biggest business risk that I see coming if we had a cyber breach, and what are we doing about it? Start there.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Although that might still be scary, for some CISOs, especially if they came up through the systems rank. Because, I joined the IT department because I didn't want to talk to people too much. Like, like I prefer the computers. But anyway, if you're going to be a CISO, you're just going to have to figure out how to deal with this. Any last words, Jake?
Any last words, Jake? It sounds like I'm done forever.
You haven't had your last meal. You're good.
Any final thoughts for today's episode? And the answer is no, Kip. I don't have any final thoughts for today's episode.
All right. I consider myself coached. Thank you. And on that note, this wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. We talked today with Carrie Perlson about why boards are getting the wrong cybersecurity information, what questions they should really be asking, and some practical tools to fix this problem. Thanks for being here, Carrie. Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.
We'll see you next time.